All right, let's go ahead and get started. We'll go ahead and get started. Does anybody have any prayer requests? Going once? Going twice? You're not the auctioneer. You always get them quiet. Any prayer requests? Kayla, how's your friend Dana's dad doing in the hospital?
He's in assisted living right now, so he's doing better, but
Okay.
still keep him on the prayer list.
All right. Anything else? Okay. You know, I actually didn't hear you.
Glenn, he's having a hard time getting his strength back.
Okay, got that time. Tony, can't believe I couldn't hear. All right, anybody else? All right, let's pray. Father God, thank you for today. Thank you for the opportunity we have to come together, to study from your word, to gather together, to praise you in just a little bit, to remember the death and resurrection of your Son, and just to take some time from our schedules to worship you. Lord, I pray that you'll be with us, that you'll bless our time, that you will bless each other for being here. Lord, I thank you for what everybody in this room and everybody that's watching online means to you, to your church, to this community. Lord, I pray that you'll be with those of our number dealing with illness, those that are dealing with being shut in, especially mindful of Kayla's friend, Dana, her dad, who's in assisted living. We're also mindful of Josh's friend, Tom Montgomery, Glenn and Carol Adams, and so many others that are on our prayer list. Lord, I just pray that you will watch over them and be with them, give them comfort, Lord. Lord, I pray that you will be with us as we go throughout our days. Help us to be examples to those we come into contact with. I pray, Lord, that you'll be with the situation that's going on in the Middle East. And if it's possible, Lord, that you would resolve that situation with the least amount of violence possible. Lord, I pray that you'll be with us, that you'll forgive us when we fall short. I thank you for your Son and for everything he's done for us and the sacrifice he made. And Lord, I thank you for the hope he's given us, and I pray that you'll send him back soon. It's through him that I pray. Amen. All right, so we're in Acts chapter 18. Last week we got through the first 5 verses. And I was thinking about it, and I if I could get the projector back, messing with Bill back there. I was thinking about it, and instead of me just summarizing, what I'd like to do is read verses 1 through 5. So if I could get somebody to read verses 1 through 5 of Acts 18, and then we'll talk about this for a second and move forward.
After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah.
All right, thank you. So we see here Paul moving from Athens to Corinth. So picture moving from Harvard to New York City. University town to commercial center. And when he gets there, the way that the text reads, it would appear that he gets there and he's sad, maybe lonely, maybe low on funds. And what does God provide?
Friends.
God provides friends. He meets Priscilla and Aquila, and through them, God provides work so that he can sustain himself. And then through those two things, God provides opportunity. He gives them the opportunity every Sabbath to be ministering to those in the synagogue. So, in the midst of all this, whatever you want to call the situation Paul was in, God provides. And then, after God provides all those things, He provides something else. Just to make sure you're paying attention. What comes after Priscilla and Aquila work in ministry at the synagogue? Well, before that, Laura, Ralph, what'd you say?
Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia.
Yeah, Silas and Timothy, a couple of old pals. They show up and they encourage him, and it says that they brought him a gift that we think may have been from the Philippian church. Maybe not, but we're not sure. But they bring him a gift, so right now, Paul's spirits should be looking up. He should be feeling pretty good. He's got his friends, old and new. He's got work. He's ministering. And because of that gift, then, Laura, what does that provide?
The time to preach exclusively.
Exactly. So he's got that gift that Timothy and Silas bring. And now Paul has time to preach exclusively and focus on his ministry. So that's where we left off last week. Somebody read verse 6.
His garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles."
So just like every other town, not to be cynical, but it's true, just like every other town, he's preaching to this group of people at the synagogue, and what do? They reject his message. But here, Luke writes that he shakes out his garments and says, "Your blood's on your own heads. I'm clean. From now on, I'm just going to the Gentiles." So the Jews got hostile. What does it mean when it says he shook out his garments? What's that?
Shook the dust off like he did.
Shook the dust off. Is there anything else there?
A witness that he had been there and spoke to him.
Yeah. He's saying, this is my witness that I've been there and I've spoke to you, and I'm not going to be responsible for you any longer. Basically, he's saying, if you're lost in hell, and likely you will be, the guilt for your destruction is your fault. You're on your own because of what's coming to you. This is a reflection from Ezekiel chapter 3 and Ezekiel chapter 33. You see, in Ezekiel, if God's messengers failed to warn the wicked man, and that man died in his iniquity, his blood was on the hand of the messenger who failed to warn him. But if God's messengers warned the wicked man, the messenger had delivered his own soul, and the wicked man was responsible for his fate. It's Ezekiel 3:18 and 19, and Ezekiel 33:8 and 9. So Paul is saying, I've tried, and you've rejected the message. So now, just as in Ezekiel, your blood's on your own hands, not mine any longer. Now Paul says, I'm done. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Was this forever or just in Corinth? Was it though?
Well, Paul is the vessel that's going to take the word to the Gentiles. So,
all right, Laura. Where did he start every time he went to a new city?
Where?
Started the synagogue.
Oh, in the synagogue.
He always went to the synagogue first. So here he's saying to the people of Corinth, I'm not coming to the synagogue anymore. I'm just going to focus on the Gentiles and move forward from there. But going forward, when he'd go to new cities like Ephesus, he would still go to the synagogue. So he wasn't saying this is permanent, but just permanent as to Corinth. Now, we don't have any evidence that he ever returned to this synagogue to do any teaching. So if Jews wished to hear him, they'd have to go where he was. But look at what happens next in verse 7. This is what's so cool about Paul's statement in verse 6. Somebody read verse 7.
Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus Justus, a worshiper of God.
So he left the synagogue. Did he go far?
Next door.
How'd you like to be that guy, Titius Justus? All right? Paul leaves the synagogue in anger, and instead of going somewhere else in the city, he sets up shop right next door. That's like McDonald's opening right up next to Wendy's. Or something, whatever you prefer. Chick-fil-A, we'll say. That's the Lord's food. All right? So, I mean, he opens up shop right next door. We don't know who this Titius Justus was, but he must have offered Paul some teaching quarters in his house right next to the synagogue. He was either a Jew or he was a proselyte who had become acquainted with Paul while Paul was teaching. So Paul's using his place to do his teaching. Again, we don't know if this guy was converted or not, but I would like to think that if this guy opens his house up to Paul, Paul probably converted him. But then it gets even better, all right? Paul has basically thrown one left jab at these Jews by moving in right next door, but look at the uppercut he delivers in verse 8. Somebody read verse 8.
Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized.
So not only does he set up shop right next door, who does it say he converted?
The synagogue leader.
Is that a big deal? I think so. This guy's the ruler of the synagogue, and verse 8 describes Paul beginning the harvest in Corinth. I mean, if Paul moving right next door to the synagogue upset the Jews, can you imagine how upset they were when Crispus converted to Christianity? I bet there were a few of them that were fired up. Crispus is mentioned again in 1 Corinthians 1, 14 through 16 as one of the few people that Paul baptized in Corinth. So to convert, think of what Crispus would have given up. Think about it. This is a big deal. Leader of the synagogue, position, his place amongst the Jews, his lifestyle. As the synagogue leader, he's responsible for the facilities. He's responsible for the service. This is huge. And it says his whole family. Now, verse 17, which we'll get to in just a little bit, is going to name a new ruler of the synagogue named Sosthenes. He probably, we think, is the one who was chosen to replace Crispus. But this is a big deal. And this is our fourth reference to household baptisms. We've already seen Cornelius, we've seen Lydia, we've seen the Philippian jailers, and now we see Crispus and his household be baptized. This is the first recorded event in which an entire Jewish family became Christians. And I want you to look at the conversion process. Notice what it says in verse 8. At the very end, when they heard, now the New American Standard says, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. The tense of the two verbs implies a process that was going on daily over a long period of time. So this is continuous, gradual growth by the church. And here, Luke writes, Crispus believed and then was baptized. Now, there's some versions that some of you all have out there that only say believed. Believe it or not. So if anybody has a version that says Crispus believed, I would tell you to go to 1 Corinthians 1:14 where it says Paul baptized this guy. Because there's some people who use this passage, depending on their translation, and say, well, Crispus just believed, he wasn't baptized. Well, Paul counters that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. So be careful of that. So not only do we have Crispus being converted, we're told that many converts from the Gentile population are baptized as well. And if you wanted to, you could look through 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Romans 16:23, and you'd see some of those people. So let me ask you a question. At this point, boy, I really skipped on my slides. at this point in Paul's ministry, just reading up to this verse, all right? Don't anybody look further, because you'll jump ahead of me. Up to this point, would it appear that Paul should be pretty happy and joyful? He's got his friends, he's got new friends, he's got converts, he's got work, he's got a gift from a church that's providing for him. People are gradually converting to the gospel every day. Would we not think this is a guy who's happy and doing well?
Yes, unless we're ready.
Yeah, just say yes. You smart aleck. Up to this point, if we don't read any further, it looks like this guy's doing well, doesn't it? Now somebody read verses 9 through 11.
Now the Lord,
Oh, go ahead. Robert.
Robert, go ahead.
now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you. For I have many people in this city. And he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
So, you might accuse me of reading into this, but when you read verses 9 through 11, how does it appear that Paul's doing? How does it appear that Paul's doing?
Right? Scared?
Afraid, scared, struggling?
Paul's getting discouraged, but Christ continually reminds him to keep going.
He does. But
We
right
see
now
that
we're
next.
looking at Paul, Grady.
Yeah.
We're looking just at Paul. Hold that thought for just a second. Does it look like Paul's struggling? On the outside, you would think he's doing well, right? On the outside, it might look like he's got it all together. He's joyful. He's baptized people. He's teaching people. The ministry's growing. But internally, what we can't see, and which God can see, though, it appears that he's afraid. It appears that he may be struggling a little bit. Maybe Paul's at a low point in his life. He's either afraid of something, or maybe he's thinking about shutting down his ministry. Maybe he's thinking, and I'm just thinking about this from the human condition, but every time he's been in a city so far, and things are going well, there's a cycle. And right up to the point where people start converting, then something bad happens and he gets ran out of that city and he's got to go somewhere else. Maybe he's thinking, oh, I'm waiting for the shoe to drop. Does this surprise you?
No, because he's human.
Yeah, Paul's human. And fear is part of the human condition, isn't it? If you look up the words fear and afraid in a Bible concordance, if y'all still have any of those, or your phone, just in the book of Genesis alone, at some time or another, every major character from Adam to Joseph was afraid. It's the human condition. And although it's natural to be afraid, it's not natural to live in fear as some do. And so the Lord comes to him and says, do not be afraid. He appeared to him to encourage him. And as Graydon was saying, Graydon, say it again.
He appeared to Paul constantly to remind him to keep going. You see that in Acts chapter 26, when Paul talks about his conversion.
Yeah. The Lord's going to appear to him several times again. Acts 26, Acts 22, Acts 27, Acts 23, 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul's going to talk about how the Lord would appear to him. Visions were given to Paul when he was in great and deep difficulties in his life. And many scholars think this was Jesus, based on what it says as to who the one in the vision is. Now here's the thing I want to talk about for just a minute, and I think this relates to us more than we'd like to admit. Why do you think Paul was afraid? I want you to speculate for a minute. Put yourself in his shoes. Grady?
Paul ran into conflict with these Jews every place he went. You know, every time he gets into a conflict with a Jew, it's no surprise.
Okay.
It's there all the time, especially in the book, even in the book of Philippians.
Okay.
Let's see it.
So maybe he's afraid because of the conflict that either had come in the past or that he was afraid was coming in the future. What else?
Wasn't he almost beat to death before?
He was almost beat to death before, so maybe he was afraid somebody was going to attack him again, which we know he was stoned at least 2 more times. We've seen once. Luann?
Not to be able to continue his work.
Yeah, maybe he was afraid that he couldn't continue his work. He was afraid of what would happen if he didn't continue his work. Anything else? Ralph?
He might have had a moment where he's looking at what needs to be done rather than what he has done and thinking, there's no way I can do all this.
Oh, man. Ralph, if you didn't hear Ralph, Ralph said maybe he had a moment where he was looking at what needs to be done rather than what he has done, and the burden scared the snot out of him. I've been there. Anybody else? I got all this work I got to get done. Instead of looking at how far you've come, you're focused on what you've got to get done, and it discourages you. What else? Do you think maybe the sin that he was seeing in Corinth with the temple of Aphrodite and the people acting the way they were acting discouraged him? Anybody been there recently? Turn on the news, social media. Sin can discourage us. Anything else? What about his personal circumstances? Surrounded by new Christians, his 2 buddies had come to town, but in this city of 125,000 people, maybe he was still feeling alone. Maybe he forgot that Jesus was still with him. It's easy to do that, isn't it? Maybe, with the absence of Dr. Luke, because Luke's back here writing in the 3rd person, he was feeling ill due to his thorn in the flesh. We don't function as well when we don't feel good, do we? No, I don't. So loneliness compounded by poverty, compounded by illness, with worry, fear of the future, fear of the unknown, fear of attack, can fill any heart with fear. Do you identify with Paul at all here? I do. It's okay if you do. Lightning's not going to strike. If it does, that's okay too. We go see Jesus. I identify with that. But look at what he's told. Jesus says, stop being afraid. And this is not a suggestion. You've probably all seen those memes that say, do not fear is in the Bible at least 365 times. It's at least that. I did the word search on my Bible app. Do you think God is trying to tell us all something? Do you notice that Jesus, when he addressed Paul's present, his past, and his future? Look at what he said. He dismissed the past when he said, Paul, do not be afraid any longer. Then he gave Paul assurance for the present when he said, you keep on preaching. Don't be silent. I'm with you. And then he addressed the future in a statement that was stated and in a statement that was implied. In the statement that was stated, he said, Paul, no one will harm you. God's going to keep you safe for preaching and teaching. Christ gave him the promise that although he'd been harmed in other cities, he would not be harmed in Corinth. And then he implies the statement of protection in the future when he says, God has many people in this city. This is in a perspective sense. There's many people here that are in sin who will hear and obey the gospel once you preach it to them, Paul. Past, present, future. And how does Paul respond to this vision? His anxiety. Go ahead, Haley.
He stayed there, so he trusted that he was not going to be harmed. So he stayed there for a while.
Yeah, he stayed there for a while. It says he stayed down a year and 6 months. So he trusted when he got this vision. His anxiety turned to anticipation and action. That assurance and that vision filled him with fresh confidence, and he settled down and evangelized that city. He evangelized that city. He evangelized into Cenchrea, according to Romans 16:1. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1, when he writes that letter, he says, to the church which is at Corinth and all the saints who are throughout Achaia, which is Corinth's state, if you will. So Paul responded to that message well. Graydon?
Paul doesn't see the big picture. When you stop and think about Stephen, when Stephen was killed and the disciples were dispersed, they went everywhere teaching the gospel. Mm-hmm. Every time the gospel is persecuted, it spreads. He can't see that either. In verse 8 is a progress report. You see, every time something happens, the gospel spreads.
Yeah.
But Paul just sees what's right in front of him. He can't see the whole picture.
Do we struggle with that sometimes?
All the time.
All the time, man. All the time. We struggle with the same thing. The reason I point this out today is because sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, we hold Paul in very high esteem, and we should. Paul did some awesome things, but Paul was human too, and Paul had struggles too, just like we do. And I think if God were here today, he would tell us the same thing. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Keep teaching, keep preaching, keep evangelizing, keep discipling. Do not be afraid. Because he said it enough in Scripture that I think he means it. Any thoughts on this? I see wheels turning. Ralph?
One thought as well, and it happens with preachers and teachers and elders, that they're always teaching, preaching, and helping others, but they need encouragement as well. They need to listen to lessons. They need to be filled sometimes as well. I can picture Paul in that scenario where he's encouraging everyone else and teaching it. He needs some encouragement as well.
That's a great statement, because I think it's important for us to remember that when you're talking to your elders, when you're talking to the ministers, they need some encouragement too, because they spend a lot of time feeding. They also need to be fed. It's a great point. Anything else?
I was very appreciative of Russ's message, anxiety and being anxious, but it's something you have to you can't just hear it, you got to just keep going back to it, to not be fearful and realizing that anything that touches us, God has allowed, so it's there for a reason. Mm-hmm. And it's important to learn the lesson.
That's a good point, Robert. And I, if you didn't hear what Robert said, we've got to keep hearing these things over and over again to be reminded of them. He's referencing Russ's lesson on anxiety, which was this past summer, a couple months ago. Doesn't feel like it. A couple months ago. And yet we need that reminder, because we let sin and Satan sometimes creep in and push those thoughts out. It reminds me of what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, when he said, I was burdened beyond what I could handle. And I'm paraphrasing. I was burdened beyond what I could handle, but it was so that I would turn to God and rely on God to get through. Isn't that what he did here? So, it was a lesson that Paul kept getting taught over and over again, and sometimes we have to do the same thing. Any other thoughts on this? All right. Let's keep going. Verses 12 through 13.
While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law.
Lord, I got to tell you, every time I read this, I wanted to say Galileo and then sing it like Queen, but, you know, I'm glad you laughed at that. That means you're awake. So, who was this Gallio? Proconsul. So, he's the proconsul of Achaia. Just to give you some background on this guy, he had a brother named Seneca. Seneca was a moralist. He was also Nero's tutor. Both were born in Cordova, Spain. Their father took them to Rome during the reign of Tiberius. And there was an inscription found at Delphi that mentioned this Gallio by name and placed him in office in Corinth in the year AD 51, which helps us to understand what time frame we're in. Several ancient writers mention that this Gallio had a mild, easygoing spirit about him. Seneca, his brother, said of him, "No mortal man is so sweet to any single person as he is to all mankind. Even those who love my brother to the very utmost of their power do not love him yet enough." So that gives you the background on what we're dealing with there. And what's really sad is both of these guys died by suicide. But this Gallio, who's in power, picture him as the governor of the province. All right, so he's the governor over this entire region. I'm going to skip ahead to this map. So when we think of Achaia, we're thinking of this whole area right here like a state. All right, so that's who this guy is. So the Jews bring Paul before this Gallio because he was having too much success at Corinth. Now, we don't know how they brought him to him. We don't know if they rushed him, surrounded him, put him in chains. Maybe they blocked his path from Titius Justus's house and arrested him. But notice what verse 13 says. This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. So all this time, whenever the Jews would bring Paul before a group, they always brought him before who? City officials, right? So they're bringing him before city officials up to this point. Now they're bringing him before a major government official. But when we see that word law, one thing scholars haven't been able to pinpoint is, do the Jews, when they say that, mean the law of Moses, or do they mean Roman law? Now, some think that that word refers to the law of Moses. In fact, the New Century Version says our law in its translation. And if they meant the law of Moses, their argument was, since Judaism is a legal religion, religio licita, the Jews had been promised protection, and Paul was disturbing that protection. If they meant Roman law, and they're appealing to Roman law, then the Jews are accusing Christianity of fostering an illegal religion, which would not be protected by Rome. But either way, however you want to view this, the Jews said Paul and all Christians should be punished by the Roman government. Now, I think they were referring to the law of Moses based on my study, but I've given you the two options. So they bring him before Gallio, and it says that they brought him before the Bema in verses 14 and 15. Does anybody know what this Bema was? And you can look in your concordance in your Bible if you need to. Bema, on certain days of each week, Roman officials would hold sessions in the marketplace. And they had this raised platform that was called the Bema. This raised platform is actually still visible in Corinth. Still has blue and white markings on it after all these years. This is translated as the judgment seat. So the Romans would carry the leader in on this portable chair to this platform covered with a purple cloth, and when the proconsul would sit there, essentially court's in session. And on these days, someone would appear to have his grievance heard by this judge. This is a very serious trial. Before, every time the Jews brought Paul before the city officials, it was related just to that city. Now, being taken before a governor of an entire province, if this governor rules against him, then Paul would have had his activities limited not just in the Roman province, but throughout Rome. This is very similar to how we have our courts set up federally with 13 different districts. If one district has a ruling, that can be used in another district to apply that law in the same manner. So this is a big deal. So up to this point, Gallio's sitting here, the Jews, having taken Paul under arrest, for lack of a better way to say it, take advantage of the opportunity, and they bring him up to this guy. And they say, he's teaching against the law, persuading people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Look at Gallio's response. Somebody read verses 14 and 15.
And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing, of wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters."
Can you picture Paul opening his mouth to speak, probably ready to preach, probably ready to drop some knowledge, and before he gets a chance, this Gallio steps up and says something like, if this was a matter of injustice, such as robbery or assault or a violent crime, I would immediately act upon it. But since it's not, handle it yourselves. Deal with it yourselves. Since this was a problem of words and not deeds, Gallio says, I'm not interested in doing anything. Now remember, this guy's connected to Nero. What had just happened to get Paul and Priscilla and Aquila to meet together in Corinth, in Rome? Yeah, the Jews had just been driven out of Rome by by the emperor, not Nero, by the emperor, because of this infighting between Christianity and Judaism. Gallio is aware of this. He hears about this stuff going back and forth, and being the executioner of Roman law says, I'm not interested in settling any judgment on this, so go deal with it yourselves. For the first time in Paul's battle with the Jews, his enemies are face to face with a Roman official they can't intimidate. Have you seen that? Every other place they go, they intimidate these officials. Here, Gallio says, deal with it yourselves. This is a significant decision. Graydon, you look like you want to say something, the way you got your hand.
What Leo's doing is establishing a precedent that Rome is not going to get involved in their religious beliefs. When you look at verse 2, you see where Claudius drove the Jews out of Rome. That could have been, we don't know this, but it could have been because they were the persecution of the Christians. So they're not going to put up with it, so they get rid of the Jews to solve the problem. And here Gallio's setting another precedent.
Yes, if you didn't hear what Graydon said, Gallio is setting a precedent. By making this decision, scholars believe that for the next 10 to 12 years, this precedent allowed Christianity as a permitted religion within the Roman Empire, until the official attitude changed when Rome burned in about AD 64. So Gallio makes this statement, sets this precedent. The Jews are sitting there, he didn't side with us. And they must have been a little bit frustrated. They must have been putting up a little fuss, because look at what he says in verse 16. What's he do? It says, and he drove them away from the judgment seat. Now, the scholars that I looked at said this probably means that they were motivated by an official's rod. Okay? So this is them telling the Jews physically and verbally, it's time for you to go. Look at how the Jews reacted. Verse 17. Somebody read verse 17.
The ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal.
Now, when I first read this, I wanted to feel bad for this guy named Sosthenes, okay? Because this text says that they took hold of Sosthenes and began beating him. Now, there's people who dispute whether they means the Jews or the Romans. I tend to lean towards the Jews. But this poor guy, who's now the new synagogue leader, we think who took over for Crispus after Crispus converted to Christianity, he's the one who would have presented his case to Gallio. He would have been the leader, being the ruler of the synagogue. And so the Jews, getting their efforts rejected, get so frustrated that they take their frustration out on this poor guy Sosthenes. And it says they began beating him in front of the judgment seat. Now, this is the same judgment seat where the guy said, if this were a crime of violence, I would do something, but since it's not, get out of here. And then he witnesses a crime of violence right in front of him, and he doesn't do anything. That's what we're dealing with here. Now, we don't know why they beat him. We think it's either because of their belief that he didn't represent their case properly, or if the Greeks did it because they were stirred up about the affair, or if it was the men who were motivating them out of the area, and they decided this is the leader, he's causing trouble, so we're going to beat him. The most logical reason is that it was the Jews, and it didn't affect Gallio at all. He just sits there and watches. Now, if you're Sosthenes, do you think that would motivate you to stay in the synagogue? Paul actually refers to Sosthenes later on in one of his letters when he says, in verse, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 1:1, when he writes to Corinth and he says, and to Sosthenes. Now, we don't know if it's the same guy, but if you took a beating by a group of people, would that make you say, yeah, these are people I want to be with? Probably not. So I'm speculating, but it'd probably be the same guy. But you decide for yourself. So, verse 18, somebody read that and then we'll wrap this up for today.
So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow.
All right, so after this decision by Gallio, Paul could stay in Corinth as long as he wanted. His opportunities to evangelize there were unlimited, not just because God's in control, but because Gallio said, let it go. This is a favorable religion. I'm not going to say anything about it. The Greek says that he remained there until sufficient days. And then when he makes his leave, he says his goodbyes, it says that he sailed out to Syria. Now, we think this is him heading towards Syrian Antioch. He's heading home to the home church that had sent him out some odd years prior. So we think this is around the spring of AD 54. And Luke compresses Paul's journey of 1,500 miles into verses 18 and 19. It also says that Priscilla and Aquila are traveling with him. And notice that Priscilla is mentioned first now. Since only they were mentioned, it's possible that Silas and Timothy were left in Corinth. With that, we're going to stop. And we're going to stop purposefully because next week we'll pick up in verse 18 talking about this weird vow that Paul makes and that many people think makes this the hardest part of Acts, the book of Acts that's out there. So with that, we'll stop and we'll see you in worship.